Greetings, friends. When it comes to the question of how warfare is waged today, the current conflict in Ukraine has shown us the importance of the old and the new. In one sense, the war is not so different from the First World War. You're just out in the countryside in muddy trenches with shells bursting all around. However, on the other hand, there are two features of the present war which illustrate 21st century developments, and these signal permanent changes in warfare. We've seen the use of surveillance and attack drones. We've seen this on an unprecedented level, and that points ultimately to a world in which robots will do the fighting. The second development is the fact that much of the heaviest fighting of the war has been waged by a private military company, or so-called private company, Wagner Group, and this is what I'll be discussing in this video. I'll deal with the question of drones in another video. So Russia has been fighting this war with a combination of militias, mercenaries, and regular army troops. Initially, there was a coup that was backed by the West in 2014 in Ukraine, and this brought together a pro-Western leader of the country as they kicked out the pro-Russian leader. So the Russian sympathetic population, or Russian population in eastern Ukraine at that time, revolted with their own private militias. The basis of this rebellion was in Donetsk. They were joined by Luhansk region. This is where the militias were carrying on the fight. Now, to some degree, they were assisted by Russia. Were they assisted with mercenaries? Were they assisted with regular army troops? I'm not sure to what extent, but mainly the fighting was militias up until last year, when it looked like Ukraine was finally going to put together the Zelensky regime was going to put together a decent army to come and snuff out these militias once and for all, and to establish control over the east. And this, together with other reasons, we're not going to go into the whole background for the war here, but at this juncture, the Russians formally got involved by invading the country. And they did so for other reasons, but one of the main reasons was to stop the attacks on the Russian population in eastern Ukraine. So destroy the Ukrainian nationalists, destroy these elements which have been fighting Russian speakers. Now, this is an interesting dynamic. You've got the cooperation of people who may be motivated to protect their families and their own soil. There you've got the motivations of maybe mercenaries coming in here later, as we're going to talk about Wagner, who maybe, it's more complicated, and then the regular army troops. So it's remarkable how Russia assists people. They assisted the Syrians, the forces of Bashar al-Assad, fighting against the American-backed various factions in the Middle East and in Syria, and they did this without numerical superiority of regular troops, but they assist in certain factions. And as we'll see, Wagner Group was fighting in Syria, getting a lot of its experience during that conflict, which we can argue Russia handled that conflict to its success. Now, when it comes to the question of mercenaries, it's interesting because that seems to bleed between the category of a paramilitary, which could be associated in supporting a state but separate from the state. It could merge with the category of something like the French Foreign Legion. And now it has become under the corporate model. Are you giving into the globalist system by allowing your military to be taken over by the corporate model, which is in a way giving credence to the capitalist model? Now, that's a question I'll just pose. I don't have a good answer to that question. But this is nothing new. What's new in the Ukraine is just the scale, the fact that Wagner Group, which is a so-called private military company, could lead the spearhead of a conventional war. We see the precedents in different times in history, but if you wanted to go only into recent history, there was DynCorp, which built Liberia, the modern state of Liberia in West Africa, and that was just a private company. contracted by the US government, given hundreds of $1 millions to go in there with the military expertise and the troops and the equipment to build the country and protect the government. And then there was Blackwater in Iraq, which later changed its name after the Nisour Square massacre incident. But they were a security firm that evolved into doing more heavy duties. But none of these corporations that I know of really participated in warfare the way we see Wagner Group doing in the Ukraine. These were mostly security groups, like the same way that there'd be security for oil companies and shipping in the East, in the Indian Ocean, like from Somalian pirates. So these security companies will fly out helicopters with their operatives to land on your merchant vessel, and they will stay on that vessel for a specified number of miles or time as you pass through dangerous waters. And they have all the techniques to shoot at pirates from atop tanker ships or whatever. This isn't really like the same kind of warfare. This is violence. This is like the border world between mafia violence. It's not really like large states getting into conflict with one another. This is what's unprecedented about what we see with Wagner Group. Blackwater in Iraq, they may have been in some firefights and stuff, and they may have been shelled, and maybe some of their operatives went on missions, but that's not really what you hear about these groups. They were mainly there to assist, and often they did mundane things like just developing infrastructure, whatever you need. These sorts of mundane incidents. And you wouldn't hear about these people dying because the main troops have gone home. Like in Iraq, it was 90% US Army troops in the invasion originally. And then by 2010, 2011, it was the American involvement in that country was 90% private actors, and by companies like Blackwater and stuff. But you don't hear about them dying because no one cares, because it's not even like a national soldier. And many of them are wouldn't even be US citizens. Some of them would be from other countries. But I don't mean to get distracted there. I'm just saying that this was the sort of role of these private military companies previously. But we now are in a world of weakened states which are not powerful enough on their own. Although I do think the Russian state is powerful, just like China. But generally the pattern is weakened states and more powerful private actors. And hence we see the rise of these globalists really dictating government policy. So it's really these corporate powers which have come to the forefront and now dictate matters around the world. At least if they haven't succeeded in that task, that is their aim. Maybe they will fail, but we see a world more akin to mafias and competing cartels, and including mafias and cartels within governments, across governments, within corporations, the same sort of organism. This is why I'm skeptical of the whole private military company, because is it ever really private? Of course not. Just like we found out during the pandemic that the so-called private companies would enforce government policy, for instance, for shopping at a grocery store and being required to wear a mask, and being told that, well, we're a private company, so we can make this demand of you, and really it's just the government policy, or it's just that overarching oligarchy and their corporate policy. The people who can control these global organizations like the CDC or the World Health Organization. If we go back in history to Europe in the 1300s, this was a time when mercenaries were the principal means of waging war. They were more efficient than national troops. I'm not sure why. I guess they were paid more. Weren't national troops paid? Maybe like, getting conscripts. You might have to pay them something because you don't want them to totally revolt or just run away, but basically they don't want to be there because most men don't want to be fighting where you can die. So how is the mercenary really better? I mean, they're not necessarily better, but why are they more effective in certain situations? Possibly because they're paid more. Possibly because they're paid for the real value that they can contribute if they have a skill. Like often in the past, the mercenaries were skilled, like pikemen or crossbowmen. They had to have some skill to use their weapons to the most effective degree and how to operate as a company well. These are skills that often conscripts will lack. Is a mercenary, however, just a derogatory word for a career soldier? Because you can be a career soldier in the U.S. Army, like that can be even a mark of pride, because like, oh, that's what my family history did that. My dad was in the Army, my grandfather was in the Army before them, we served here, some of them talk about like, oh, Afghanistan was wonderful country for soldiering. They talk about it as soldiering, like it's this landscape that's really great for soldiering. And that they're both paid professionals. The mercenary, the national, you could say, well, the professional soldier is ultimately patriotic to his country. Maybe mercenary can maybe have higher loyalties, maybe not. But again, the whole boundaries here seem to merge. You've got like, what about the paramilitaries in Central America and South America, assisting dictators, assisting whatever regime? How is that any different from Wagner Group? The only difference is that those groups like the Contras in Central America that the Reagan administration was funding in the 80s, it was mostly guerrilla warfare, from what I can tell. Smaller numbers of soldiers, smaller, not conventional warfare. But the career soldier isn't called up to serve his country in a crisis. He's made the conscious decision to be in the soldier's trade for life. So I don't see that as being too much different from a PMC, a private military company, except that maybe the PMC offers more opportunities. Maybe there's less regulations and rules that would be found in the context of the military, which is under the purview of the government. Is it true that Wagner is mostly composed of convicts? Like they say, oh, well, they offer prisoners who are in for life or a long time the opportunity for freedom to redeem yourself if you go and fight and expose yourself to risk or prove your bravery. And some of them take them up on that opportunity. I don't know if that's true. It's difficult to tell when you research this thing because it's such a politically relevant topic at the moment. I think it's exaggerated. I don't think that the majority of Wagner combatants are convicts or ex-convicts. I don't think that's true. Certainly a number of them are. I don't think that the organization would want to be too heavy with ex-convicts because that would start to present problems of its own. You would have to have a certain way of controlling these men. You wouldn't want their numbers to get out of hand, but you would have enough of them to use them effectively. I don't know if it's true whether they send convicts first through minefields. I've seen some picture that people claimed, oh, those were all convicts that got killed in a minefield. I don't know if that's true. I doubt that would be normal practice because it wouldn't really work for the company's message, because the whole idea is that you will fight if you are respected and fight when you are in a tight situation, but you do not sacrifice your life in a stupid fashion and needlessly. And that is not the manner in which the Russians have conducted this war, whether with their regular army troops or with these private groups, even though it's not really their command. When it comes to the question of convicts, I mean, I know a bit about the French Foreign Legion history. And in that case, it was men who were down on their luck and they wanted a chance to redeem themselves. Yes, some of them may have committed a crime, but some of them might have just been like out of luck, maybe in debt. Maybe they had to flee from another country. Again, maybe for some kind of crime, but not always the worst reasons. Some of them wanted adventure. Some of them wanted both a chance to redeem themselves and to have adventure. And there could be genuine psychopaths there, but these men would tend to get rooted out because that would also be a threat to group cohesion. And in what sense is this even a company? Does it have a CEO? Is Mr. Prigozhin the CEO? Do they have publicly traded stock? I mean, I would be very amazed if I found that to be true. I did hear an anecdote from someone who was discussing this question. I can't say whether it's representative, but it was an interesting anecdote. And this was about a Russian officer, or a former Russian officer. He was frustrated by the corruption in the Russian army, so he joined Wagner, where his talents and ambition allowed him to thrive. So there could be some truth to this story. I don't know how corrupt the Russian army is today. It probably has corruption. I don't know if it's as bad as it was during the Soviet years. Certainly we know that the Ukrainian army is corrupt. I mean, I assume the American army is corrupt too to some degree. So every big army like that there's going to be nepotism. There's going to be bureaucratic headaches. There's going to be bullshit that you have to deal with. So I can see how the draw of a private company would take some of the more capable men. And this might explain why Wagner Group has been successful, or at least why Russia has let them lead the spearhead of fighting their most important battle, which has been the theater around Bakhmut, which centers on the whole Ukrainian defensive line in the Donbass. What is the motivation to a mercenary? If you say, oh, the mercenaries aren't really motivated, they just want money, they just want to save their skin, and if you just want to save your skin, why are you going to die? Well, hold on, that's part of the downside, but if you're down on your luck, what do you have left to lose? The French Foreign Legion, they had a saying, I think it was from the Algerian campaigns in the 19th century. I don't remember the entirety of it, but it went something like, once you realize you are already dead, you don't have anything to fear. Something like already realizing that you're dead. And it could also be true that men who are drawn from the underclass are tougher. And they don't like to be sacrificed needlessly because they have no higher loyalties. But if they're in a tight spot, then they're going to fight. And this was the case with the French Foreign Legion, who didn't have much allegiance to the French state. Many of them were not French. And perhaps they had some bond with their fellow soldiers. That could also explain part of it. There's reason to think that mercenaries won't have the motivation, but then sometimes there are reasons that they could have motivation. More motivation than your common regular soldier. So I'm just saying to consider that. Now, is Wagner Group a risk to the Kremlin regime if these mercenary groups get too important, as we see with Wagner Group? It has become very important. Well, I don't think it's a threat right now. Not yet. But it is something noteworthy. It's something that the Kremlin would obviously be keeping an eye on, because the mercenary is said to fight for money and for himself, so why would he ultimately be loyal to any state or ruler? Well, he'll be loyal if he's paid well and if he's given respect by the ruler. So in the past, like during the 30 Years' War from 1618 to 1648, well, often, I was going to say rulers had to respect their mercenaries, but actually mercenaries were often underpaid or not paid during that war, and then they plundered the countryside, and that's how they paid themselves. That war was disastrous because of mercenaries, and it helped foster the nation-state system of rules and having national armies and trying to limit mercenary groups as much as possible because of how it could just prolong warfare. Because as long as mercenaries can be paid, as long as the corporate model is there, you can always get new recruits. However, mercenary groups can also limit war to low-scale intensity by limiting the involvement of whole national armies, which necessarily mobilized entire states. So there is the other side of the coin. So the tension does exist between Wagner and some people in the Kremlin regime, but this is natural in warfare. There's always going to be competing egos in warfare. And because Wagner captured Soledar, the Ukrainian town just to the north of Bakhmut, initially the Russians, the government officials, just talked of Russian forces capturing the town and congratulating their soldiers for doing this. And obviously some in Wagner were not happy about this because it was really them that captured the town, although they did do so there were some paratroopers from the Russian army that assisted the capture of Soledar. But it was mainly a Wagner operation. They were the ones who stormed into the buildings and stuff. But later, probably after a discussion where Prigozhin flew to Moscow and to talk with whoever was in charge of maybe Putin himself, And then they issued another statement the following day, which recognized the value of Wagner and recognized their contribution to winning this battle. So again, it's tensions that you would expect to exist in a war. There's always going to be competing egos. It's not necessarily like, oh, Wagner Group is now going to be a threat to the regime. But you do have to wonder, if they're not respected and they're not paid well, then in the future the corporate model could be employed against them. But that same model, you could say that about any nation state. You could say that about America, about China. I mean, it's kind of besides the point. So I was mentioning that I don't really see Wagner as being a private group or private company. Obviously, it's operating in conjunction with the state. We've seen that the private sphere and the government sphere are not clearly separated. Not that that's even a bad thing either. It's just inevitable. So the fact that the United States has now painted a target on any Wagner operative around the world and declaring them criminals, while unfortunate for Wagner, is not dishonest, because Wagner has been acting as an agent of Russia, so the US regime has chosen to make Russia their enemy, so it's logical for them to do anything they can to harm Wagner. Wagner, as I mentioned, gained experience fighting in Syria. It operates as a private army. It has tanks, it has artillery. I think their main selling point was that they were highly trained in combat tactics, and their soldiers had specialization in house-to-house urban warfare. This is what has made them very effective. And operating in conjunction with artillery, they've been able to inch forward at a steady pace and slowly tighten the vice grip around this city of Bakhmut. They look for a position that has been weakened, and then after it's been shelled, they advance. No side in this war, not the Russian side, not the Ukrainian side, has been using human wave tactics. That is a fantasy. There might have been human wave tactics in the First World War, and it was a disaster. And since that time, human wave tactics don't really happen. Even movies about the Second World War, where you see the Soviets doing human wave tactics in Stalingrad. What was that movie over 10 years ago with Jude Law, where he plays a Soviet sniper, and then they're showing the Russians like they'll shoot you if you're retreating? As far as I know, that's mostly myth. What we see in this war on both sides, but the Ukrainians specialized this in the beginning, and now Russians have learned how to do it, is how to send out small parties, often less than a dozen men, reconnaissance parties, or storming a specific position with supporting fire and using grenades. You see small groups here and there like that. You don't ever see giant waves of men out in the open unless they're genuinely running for their lives. But you don't want to be in the open at all in this war, because it's mostly open countryside and you'll be killed by shell fragments. 99% of the casualties in this war have been from shells. And the reason that the Russians are basically winning is because they have about 6 to 7 times more heavy guns than the Ukrainians. Maybe more than that. And their supply of munitions is 20 to 1 of what the West can supply. The majority of warfare is not what you see in Hollywood. You're not going to get to shoot your gun very often, if at all, and you're probably not going to see the enemy. Now, for some of these positions on the front lines, they probably do see the enemy and shoot at them, but generally, you don't see the enemy. You stand in a trench and you hope not to die. So the job of the soldier, as one former British volunteer for Ukraine said recently in his interview with Lindy Beige, the YouTuber, and this is a pro-Ukrainian side, but he said something very honest, which was that the job of the soldier is to stand in a trench and die. That's mostly what warfare is. You stand there cold and wet and suffering while not eating well, sleeping poorly, and trying to outlast the enemy, who is largely doing the same thing as you. And you try to see who's going to break first. That's what warfare is. You stand in a trench and die. Not grand sweeping movements across the countryside. But when it comes time to take the initiative, Russia has chosen Wagner to be the spearhead. Their deaths have less effect on public sentiment back home. Their training and their tactics are often superior, or at least competent. and it seems that they operate well and dynamically. They're not constrained by such limitations of bureaucracy and the proper or the official command structure. They have a warrior's culture of bravery. They feature the skull on their flag. Previous groups have used the skull. What that comes from in military culture, at least European military history, is that when certain units would do that, it's about saying that we're already dead. We are not afraid of death. Smile at death. That's what the skull is about. Hasta luego, amigos.